There are moments in history when the very air seems to tremble, when the world holds its breath, waiting to see what destiny will decide. The early hours of June 6, 1944 were one of those moments. A few hours before sunrise, somewhere along the cold and unforgiving waters of the English Channel, tens of thousands of young Allied soldiers sat silently inside steel landing crafts. The rain was heavy, the wind was brutal, and the sea tossed their boats like toys. Yet not a single heart trembled, not with fear, but with determination. They knew that if they succeeded, the war could end. If they failed, darkness might conquer the world forever. This was not just another battle. This was the beginning of the largest seaborne invasion in human history. This was D-Day Operation Overlord, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. While these men waited, praying in the darkness, miles away in Berlin, one man slept deeply, unaware that the world he dreamed of controlling was beginning to collapse. That man was Adolf Hitler. Even at this crucial stage of World War II, Hitler believed that the Allies would never dare to launch a direct assault across the English Channel. He believed his defenses, the Atlantic Wall, were impenetrable. He believed his enemy lacked courage, unity, and vision. And above all, he believed fate was on his side. But fate, on that morning, chose a different path. It was 3:30 a.m. when the first whispers of the invasion reached the German high command. Reports came in through frantic radio transmissions that enemy paratroopers had landed across key areas of Normandy. The night sky had been pierced by thousands of parachute shadows, drifting silently through darkness, touching French soil like falling stars. Confusion spread through the German communication chain. Some officers believed it was a distraction, others assumed it was a small raid. No one understood the scale of what was coming. No one except Eisenhower. Eisenhower had spent months planning this moment, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The pressure was so heavy that the night before the invasion, he wrote a letter accepting full responsibility if the mission failed. In that emotional letter, he wrote, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He knew that tens of thousands of soldiers were risking their lives because of his decision. He understood the cost. He understood the stakes. And still, he chose to go forward. That decision would change the fate of the world. Meanwhile, inside Hitler's headquarters, something surreal was unfolding. Despite alarming reports and requests for immediate instruction, Hitler was not awakened. His closest commanders were too afraid to disturb him. Even as the invasion intensified, thunderous explosions, gunfire shaking the shores of Normandy, Germany's supreme leader slept. The storm of war had begun without him. By dawn, the first Allied landing crafts smashed against the beaches. The doors opened and young soldiers, some just 18 or 19 years old, rushed forward into a hell no one could have ever imagined. Bullets tore through the air like lightning. The sand turned red. The screams of pain and courage echoed against the cliffs. Many never reached the shore, yet they kept moving, step after step, crawling through water and fire, pushing through everything that stood between them and freedom. Their bravery was not born from hatred, it was born from hope. They fought for families they loved, for children yet unborn, for peace they had never known. And still, Hitler slept. It was not until a.m. that morning when Hitler finally awoke. A trembling officer approached him with a message that would shake the foundation of Nazi power. The words spoken were simple, but they cut deeper than any sword. "My Führer, the invasion has begun." For a moment, Hitler stared silently, unable to process what he heard. Then, like a storm erupting inside his chest, his face twisted with fury. He demanded maps, reports, explanations. His voice exploded through the room. "Impossible. The Allies cannot be invading Normandy. The real attack will come at Pas de Calais." He believed wholeheartedly that the invasion was a trick, a fake, a decoy. He insisted that Eisenhower would never risk everything on what he considered the weakest part of the Atlantic Wall. He believed Allied forces were too afraid of German defenses. He believed their courage would collapse. And he believed his intuition was never wrong. But on that day, Hitler's arrogance became his greatest enemy. While Hitler argued and dismissed the warnings, Eisenhower issued a speech that would echo across generations. He told his troops, "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you." Those words ignited something powerful and unbreakable will. As German artillery rained down, Allied soldiers fought like lions. They crawled through explosions, climbed over steel obstacles, and dragged wounded brothers through sand soaked with blood. They kept moving not because they were fearless, but because they refused to surrender. As reports continued to flood in, Hitler's rage grew louder. He shouted commands, slammed his fists on the table, accused his officers of exaggeration, of weakness, of failing to see what he refused to believe. He insisted again that Normandy was a distraction. He refused to send reinforcements. He refused to release the armored divisions waiting to defend Calais. He refused to listen to reality. His generals tried desperately to reason with him, telling him the invasion was massive, real, and unstoppable. But Hitler, blinded by ego, declared, "Eisenhower is a fool. The real invasion will come elsewhere. Normandy means nothing." In that moment, the world changed forever, not because of his strength, but because of his denial. While Hitler argued with his own commanders, Eisenhower executed one of the most intelligent and daring military strategies in history. Using deception, misdirection, and overwhelming force, the Allies had fooled Hitler completely. On the beaches, soldiers continued to fall, but reinforcements arrived, wave after wave. The sky filled with Allied aircraft, supporting the troops below. Naval ships unleashed thunder that shook the earth. Step by step, the Allies pushed forward. Every inch was paid for with blood and sacrifice, but they refused to turn back. They climbed cliffs under enemy fire. They destroyed bunkers with bare hands. They fought with everything they had, because they knew freedom was on the line. When Hitler finally realized the truth, that the invasion was real, that the Allies were not retreating, that Normandy was collapsing into his worst nightmare, his anger turned into fear. Fear that his empire was crumbling. Fear that his destiny was slipping through his fingers. Fear that he would lose everything he had built through intimidation and terror. The moment Hitler saw the map and understood the scale of Eisenhower's operation, he whispered words that even his closest aides never forgot. Words filled not with strength, but with shock and disbelief. "This is the beginning of the end." Those words marked the turning point of World War II. The walls of his empire began to crack. The dictator who once believed he could control the world now watched it fall apart piece by piece. And for the first time, Hitler saw something he had never seen before: defeat. Because on that day, June 6, 1944, courage defeated fear, unity defeated tyranny, humanity defeated hatred, and the world would never be the same again. When Hitler's trembling voice uttered the shocking words, "This is the beginning of the end," the atmosphere inside the German headquarters shifted instantly. The room fell silent, so silent that the sound of breathing felt loud. The commanders who once stood confidently in front of their leader now stared at the floor, terrified to speak, afraid to even meet each other's eyes. For years, Hitler had spoken with absolute certainty, predicting victory after victory, promising that his Reich would last 1,000 years. Now, for the very first time, doubt cracked his voice. He, the man who ruled through fear, sounded afraid. That single moment shattered the illusion of invincibility around him. Outside the bunker walls, Berlin continued its normal rhythm: factory sirens, marching boots, barking orders. But inside the command room, panic spread like wildfire. Maps were unrolled across tables, red arrows drawn to show a light advancement along the Normandy coastline. Reports came in faster than anyone could read. Commanders were shouting over one another, desperately trying to understand the scale of the disaster. Units were calling for reinforcements that did not exist. Officers begged for permission to release armored divisions. Radio operators yelled into microphones asking for support. It sounded like chaos. It sounded like losing. Hitler stared at the maps with shaking hands. His face turned pale, the confidence drained from his expression. He had always believed that the Atlantic Wall would hold, that his fortifications along the coast would be unbreakable. He believed Germany's steel defenses were stronger than any army of men. But what he never understood was this: walls made of concrete cannot stop souls made of courage. Eisenhower knew that. The American, British, Canadian, and Allied soldiers storming the beaches were not fighting for territory or power. They were fighting for the right to live in a world free from terror. That kind of strength cannot be measured with numbers or maps. As more reports flowed in, Hitler's emotions spiraled between rage and panic. One moment he was shouting violently, pounding his fists against the table, his voice echoing off the walls. The next moment, he was quiet and motionless, staring blankly, as if his mind were fading into a nightmare he could not escape. His officers exchanged fearful glances, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. He screamed accusations, blaming everyone except himself. He accused commanders of cowardice, of failing to anticipate the attack, of failing to protect his empire. But deep inside, he knew the truth: his downfall was not caused by others. It was caused by his own arrogance. Outside the bunker, the skies over Normandy roared with the thunder of Allied aircraft. Airstrikes pounded German defensive lines, shaking bunkers to their foundations. Soldiers who once believed they were safe inside fortress walls now found themselves trapped under collapsing concrete. Allied naval artillery fired from miles offshore, sending massive waves crashing onto the beaches. Smoke covered the coastline thick, black, choking, and blinding. Bodies lay scattered across the sand. The sea ran red with blood. And yet, the Allied troops kept moving. Many soldiers could barely feel their legs as they pushed forward, dragging themselves over broken ground, bullets tearing into the sand beside them. Some fought with burned hands, broken bones, and shattered helmets. Others clutched rosaries, letters, or photographs of the people they loved, promising silently that they would return home. They were terrified. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision to move forward despite it. Every step they took was a step closer to breaking the chains of oppression around the world. Every heartbeat was a drum of freedom, echoing across history. Back in Berlin, Hitler demanded his generals bring him Rommel the Desert Fox, the brilliant commander known for his strategic genius. But Rommel was not in Berlin. He was hundreds of miles away, recovering from injuries after surviving a brutal air attack, unaware that the war's greatest moment had arrived. Without him, the German command was fractured and powerless. Hitler cursed Rommel's absence, shouting that if he were present, everything would be different. But leadership is not measured by presence, it is measured by vision. Eisenhower had that vision. Hitler did not. As the day progressed, Hitler's frustration turned into desperation. He ordered counterattacks that were impossible to execute. He demanded divisions that no longer existed. He issued commands that ignored reality. His generals attempted to explain the situation. Allied forces were gaining ground faster than expected. German defenses were overwhelmed. Communications were failing. Panzer divisions were stuck waiting for orders due to Hitler's refusal to release them earlier. The Allies had already secured critical footholds at multiple landing points. The window for stopping the invasion was closing rapidly. Hitler refused to accept any of it. His voice rose to a scream as he shouted, "How could this happen? How could they break through our defenses? Eisenhower is bluffing. This cannot be the real invasion." But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. His face twisted with disbelief, pain, and fury. He slammed his fist so hard against the table that blood dripped from his knuckles. Even so, his generals stood frozen, unable to respond. Years of ruling through intimidation had created fear, not loyalty. No one around him was strong enough to tell the truth. Meanwhile, across the channel, Eisenhower sat in quiet tension, watching reports come in hour by hour. Every number represented real lives: sons, husbands, brothers. He felt a weight so heavy that even breathing felt difficult. He knew that thousands of families would receive telegrams that would break their hearts. He knew that every decision he made would decide the fate of nations. Yet, he remained calm, not because he lacked emotion, but because he knew the world needed his strength. Leadership is sacrifice. Leadership is responsibility. Leadership is courage under pressure. The contrast between Eisenhower and Hitler could not have been more striking. One man ruled through fear, convinced he was greater than all. The other led through humility, aware that he was only human, but entrusted with extraordinary duty. One man refused to listen to anyone. The other surrounded himself with voices of reason. One believed he could control fate. The other prepared for every outcome. By afternoon, Hitler's anger transformed into something darker: paranoia. He believed traitors were sabotaging his army from within. He accused his officers of betrayal. He questioned their loyalty, demanding names, demanding explanations, demanding answers that did not exist. Some officers trembled so badly that they could barely speak. They feared that the wrong word could cost their lives. Hitler's eyes were wild, filled with the rage that surpassed reason. He was a man watching his empire collapse in front of him, powerless to stop it. All the while, Allied soldiers continued inch by inch toward victory. They advanced through barbed wire, minefields, machine gun nests, and artillery storms. Medics carried injured men on their backs, sometimes using their own bodies as shields. Chaplains cried prayers over the dying, promising them peace. Brothers held each other's hands, refusing to let go. The beaches of Normandy became the birthplace of a new world, a world where tyranny would not rise again without resistance. As night approached, Hitler demanded updates once more. When he learned that the Allies had successfully broken through German lines and were pushing steadily inland, his body collapsed into his chair. The weight of defeat pressed heavily on his shoulders. His voice lowered to a whisper as he spoke words loaded with despair. "If we lose in the West, we lose the war." Those words echoed through the command room like thunder. The officers who heard them realized something monumental. The man who once promised glory now admitted defeat. The mask of invincibility was gone. The dictator who once looked untouchable now looked small, fragile, broken. Outside, the city lights of Berlin glowed against the night sky. But inside the bunker, everything felt dark. Hitler's hands trembled as he stared into nothingness. Trapped inside his own collapsing world, he realized that the tide had turned forever, and there was no escape. Destiny had chosen its side, and it was not his. From that moment forward, Hitler would never again experience confidence, victory, or certainty. D-Day had destroyed more than his military power. It shattered the myth of his control. For the rest of the night, Hitler paced relentlessly back and forth, muttering to himself, consumed by fear. His voice grew unstable, his decisions irrational. He spoke of miracle weapons, phantom armies, and impossible strategies. His officers listened silently, knowing none of it could save them. Outside, distant thunder echoed from Allied bombs, shaking the continent. Every explosion was a drumbeat of approaching justice. Meanwhile, Eisenhower looked up at the dark sky above Normandy, filled with the smoke of war. Tears gathered in his eyes, not from grief alone, but from gratitude. He knew the bravery he had witnessed that day would be remembered forever. He knew the sacrifices made on those beaches would shape the future of humanity. He whispered quietly into the night, "They did it. They truly did it." And somewhere deep in Berlin, Hitler whispered something very different, something that revealed the truth he had spent years denying. "We cannot win now." Those words marked the beginning of the collapse that would change the fate of the world. D-Day was no longer just a battle, was a message. A message that tyranny would always fall. A message that courage would always rise. A message that freedom would always triumph over oppression. The sun would rise again, but for Hitler, the light was already gone. Night descended over Europe like a heavy curtain, thick with smoke, fear, and the echoes of war. The beaches of Normandy were no longer beaches, they were graves. They were scars. They were the birthplace of hope forged in fire. Bodies lay still on the sand, where waves washed gently over them, as if the sea itself was trying to carry them home. The roar of artillery quieted slightly, replaced by the low moans of wounded soldiers, the whispered prayers of medics, and the broken sobs of brothers who refused to leave each other behind. The moonlight glistened softly on helmets, weapons, and fallen men. It was a night carved into the soul of humanity forever. As Allied troops secured their positions inland, they looked around at the devastation and understood the scale of what they had survived. They had entered hell and walked out breathing. They had faced death and refused to bow. Many stared numbly into the distance, unable to process what had happened. Others clutched letters and photographs from home, pressing them to their chests, as if reminding themselves why they were still alive. Some lay in silence, staring at the stars, wondering if God had heard their cries. And many whispered the same question: was it worth it? The answer would take time, but history already knew it was. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, inside Hitler's bunker in Berlin, darkness consumed everything. The room that once radiated power now felt suffocating, filled with the stench of sweat and fear. Officers who once spoke loudly now whispered, and even the whisper felt too loud. Paper maps were torn, pencils broken, telephones ringing endlessly with nothing but bad news. Hitler sat slumped behind a large wooden table, his face buried in his hands, his eyes dark and sunken. He looked nothing like the dictator the world once feared. He looked like a defeated man waiting for the inevitable. He asked again and again the same haunting questions. How could this happen? Why did my generals fail me? Why did destiny betray me? But the truth he refused to say aloud, was painfully clear to everyone around him. He had failed himself. For years, Hitler had built his power on lies, hatred, and fear. His empire was never strong, it was fragile, held together by violence and intimidation. The moment courage stood up against it, the moment free men decided to fight, the moment the world united against his terror, everything he built crumbled. And he understood now that Eisenhower's invasion was more than a military operation. It was a declaration that the world refused to submit. His generals stood silently as Hitler raged, pacing the floor with frantic steps. He ordered impossible counterattacks, demanded phantom divisions that no longer existed, and insisted reinforcements would arrive that were already destroyed. Every command he issued revealed more clearly that he was living in a fantasy. He tried to rewrite reality so he wouldn't have to face the truth. The war was lost. At one moment, he stopped walking and stared blankly into space, his voice shaking as he spoke. The Allies will push us back until nothing is left. This is the beginning of our collapse. His generals said nothing. What could they say? There were no words that could save him. No strategy could undo the storm that had been unleashed. No weapon could fight destiny. On the other side of Europe, Eisenhower sat in a quiet command tent surrounded by war maps and casualty lists. His shoulders were heavy, his expression solemn. He looked nothing like a man celebrating victory. Instead, he looked like a man carrying the weight of thousands of souls. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Every victory cost something, and today, we paid in blood." He refused to sleep. He stayed awake through the night reading reports, writing messages to grieving families, and praying silently for lives still hanging in the balance. Leadership is not glory, it is burden. Eisenhower felt every life lost as if it was his own wound. As dawn approached on June 7, 1944, sunlight touched the beaches where bodies still lay. The survivors stood in silence, their eyes red, their hands trembling, their hearts broken. Yet within that silence, something powerful emerged: resolve. They looked at the destruction around them and whispered to themselves and to God that the sacrifices would not be in vain. They promised to keep moving, to keep fighting, to keep climbing forward until tyranny was buried forever. Back in Berlin, Hitler called for a private meeting with his closest officers. The room was dim and cold, lit only by candlelight since constant bombing threatened the power supply. Hitler's voice cracked as he spoke, his words slow and heavy. Everything depends on holding the Western Front. If we cannot stop them at Normandy, then Germany is finished. No one answered. Silence suffocated the room. Hitler demanded projections, solutions, miracles, anything. His officers presented charts and casualty reports, their hands shaking. The numbers were catastrophic. German units were shattered, supply lines were failing, and morale was collapsing. Every strategic path led to the same conclusion: there was no saving the war now. Hitler's face contorted, his eyes red with rage and grief. He shook his head over and over, refusing to accept the truth. He slammed his fist into the table, screaming, "This cannot be the end. I will not allow it." But history does not ask permission. History moves when courage commands it to move. Meanwhile, Allied forces pushed forward relentlessly. Villages were liberated one by one. French civilians ran into the streets crying tears of joy, kissing the hands of soldiers, waving flags they had hidden for years. They brought bread, water, wine, anything they could give. Women hugged soldiers. Children climbed onto tanks. Priests rang church bells for the first time since occupation. It was not just the liberation of towns, it was the liberation of souls. Freedom did not whisper, freedom roared. Hitler watched all of this through reports filled with growing panic. He threw papers across the room, screaming that he had been betrayed by his own fate. He grew paranoid, believing everyone around him was conspiring against him. He ordered arrests. He demanded executions. He accused trusted commanders of treason. His world shrank inward into a cage he built himself. His empire was collapsing, not from outside alone, but from the poison he had planted within it years ago. By the time the Allies broke through Normandy and began their unstoppable march across France, Hitler no longer shouted. The rage was replaced by silence, a silence more terrifying than his words. He sat alone for long hours, staring at nothing, refusing food, refusing sleep, refusing to accept what everyone else already knew. He had lost. When Paris was liberated, Hitler whispered the words through clenched teeth, filled with bitterness and defeat. The war is lost now. Those around him described seeing a man who had once believed he was untouchable, now trembling like a frightened child. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold a pen. He stopped talking about victory. Instead, he spoke about revenge, death, and destruction, all signs of a broken spirit drowning in despair. Meanwhile, Eisenhower watched the map lines move steadily across Europe, marking progress but with extraordinary sacrifice. He stood quietly in front of his soldiers, many wrapped in bandages, many missing limbs, many grieving the friends who lay buried far behind them. He spoke to them not as a commander, but as a fellow human being. You changed the course of history. The world will remember what you did here. Freedom lives because of you. Tears filled the eyes of hardened warriors. For the first time, they dared to believe that peace might be possible. Months later, as Allied forces approached Berlin, Hitler descended physically and mentally into complete collapse. He locked himself in the underground of Führer, refusing daylight, refusing truth. Outside, bombs shook the city. The walls trembled. The ground shook. The empire he once promised would last 1,000 years fell apart in a matter of days. The streets of Berlin filled with smoke and fire. Civilians fled in terror. The war that Hitler unleashed now crushed him beneath its own weight. Inside the bunker, Hitler faced the final reality. The world he dreamed of ruling had rejected him. The people he promised glory now cursed his name. The generals who once praised him now avoided his eyes. The man who once shouted for domination now whispered to himself in fear. Finally, he spoke the last words, acknowledging the truth he had resisted for too long. The war is lost. Fate has turned against me. Shortly after, Hitler ended his life deep beneath the burning city, unable to face a world where courage defeated cruelty. A few days later, Germany surrendered. Church bells rang across Europe. People filled the streets crying tears of relief. Families embraced. Flags waved. The world breathed again. Children who had grown up under the shadow of war finally saw light. The sky, once blackened by smoke, now filled with color. Eisenhower stood silently, watching soldiers returning home, some walking, some carried, some arriving in flag-covered coffins. He whispered softly to himself, "War ends, but the price remains." He visited graveyards where thousands of white crosses lined the earth. He walked slowly between them, touching names carved in stone. He felt the wind brush past, carrying voices of lives cut short. He removed his cap and bowed his head, tears falling freely. He understood that victory was not a celebration, it was sacred. D-Day did not just change the war, it changed the world. It proved that even in the darkest moment of history, humanity can rise. It proved that dictators fall, but courage lasts forever. And it proved that freedom is never given, it is earned. Today, when we walk the beaches of Normandy, we feel a silence unlike any other. The wind whispers through the grass. The waves touch the shore gently, as if protecting the memories resting beneath. The white crosses stand like quiet guardians, telling the world, remember us. Remember what we gave. Remember what we fought for. The ghosts of June 6th still speak. Not with words, but with legacy. They remind us that the battle against evil is never truly finished. Every generation must choose courage over fear, unity over division, and love over hate. Because the moment we forget, history repeats itself. Hitler once said on that morning of June 6, 1944, "This is the beginning of the end." And he was right, just not in the way he intended. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for tyranny, cruelty, and one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was the moment when ordinary men became extraordinary heroes. It was the moment when the world refused to surrender. It was the moment when humanity stood together and said, loudly and forever, never again.